Nearly 5 years after its prior game, The Evil Within 2, Tango Gameworks has returned, this time with something a little different, having shifted entirely to the first person and delivering a unique new setting. Ghostwire Tokyo is an open-world horror adventure with some unique twists and turns and some unexpected familiarity. Today, we're going to be examining the PlayStation 5 version of the game specifically, talking about all of its modes, there's 6 of them by the way, and different permutations of each of them, and we'll also discuss the various quirks and features that you can expect from this version of the game. To do that, however, I wanted to bring along the man who's looking closely at the PC version of this game, Alex Battaglia.
Hey there, John. Yeah, PC version like this one on PlayStation 5 has its quirks of its own, so we definitely need 2 videos out of this. And I've also sampled it for reasons regarding my PC video there on PlayStation 5 for a while, so I do have some experience, and I'm excited to talk about it.
All right, let's get into it. So, for starters, they've built this game using Unreal Engine 4, which is a unique left turn after The Evil Within had been created within the idtech framework of sorts. They modified an older version of idtech to suit their needs. I think they had a different name for it for The Evil Within 2, but either way, this is an example of a studio switching to Unreal. And it's probably overall a good example because the visual quality on display here I think is generally quite good. It's essentially Tokyo at night, specifically the Shibuya area. It's always rainy. Well, not always raining, but it's always rainy. There's reflective puddles everywhere.
Yeah.
Just beautiful lighting and design, and there's some unique touches to it, like the raindrops, for instance, which use the kanji ame, which is rain, of course. That's actually the texture they use for each raindrop. And you'll see this type of little weird detail throughout, and I like that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think the switch to Unreal Engine 4 in terms of a visual feature set is really well done here. There's a couple of other things that they added in as a result of using Unreal Engine 4, SSGI, that we can talk about a bit later in a more critical sense, but it adds in, it replaces SSAO and it gives a layer of bounce lighting to a lot of areas in the game. Another highlight, I think, too, are the first-person animations.
These are absolutely stunning, actually. This is probably the highlight of the game, especially with motion blur enabled, by the way. And we'll talk about that because there's 5 settings for that too. But essentially, when you attack in this game, your character uses their hands for sort of the mystical powers, primarily. And all the animation work and the individual finger movement and the transitions between the different movesets, it's all beautifully handled and really unique, actually. We've not seen something quite like this in a game, so I appreciate what they're doing there.
Yeah, I think that uniqueness goes over to the general world design as well. After playing through so many games that take place in New York City or something like that, seeing the unique visual styles of this area of Tokyo here, and that applies to, the hand animations you were talking about earlier, like you interact with one of the game things by praying. I don't know if you've gotten to that at all yet. There's a lot of really cool things like that. How they actually work as a game mechanic is quite different.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we both like the sort of set design and the direction they went there, and it does feel authentic, but unfortunately I was a little bit surprised to discover that it's essentially a Ubisoft-like game in design.
Totally surprised me. Oh my god.
It to me feels like they sort of looked at something like Far Cry and built the game design from that, because you are essentially building out your map. You're going to these gates here and essentially freeing them, which opens up more parts of the map. There's actually these things where you're almost like capturing the bases from Far Cry, and it even has the camera that pulls back when you complete that task. And there's just side missions and icons littering the map everywhere. And of course, you can critical path it, which does help. I mean, I did appreciate even early on, like right away in the second chapter, where you have to go up to that observation deck. The climb up that building was pretty interesting, and there was some challenging gameplay up there that I enjoyed somewhat.
That was the more interesting one, yeah, sure.
But by and large, I was a little surprised that they decided to go in this direction after The Evil Within 2, which I think did this sort of hub-like design extremely well. With that small city area you could explore, but it sort of linked together all these really cool levels that you would go into that were more linear in design. So It's not necessarily bad, and I think plenty of people will be into this.
Yeah, one thing that, you're saying there's a critical path. You can just play all the missions if you like, and ignore all the open world bloat for the most part. But I think that brings us to the core combat design, which it is a little binary, and depending upon how you're playing it with it, I played a lot on PC with the DualSense controller, as well as with an Xbox 360 pad and mouse and keyboard. And let me tell you, those controls on a gamepad, woo, John, they are not the best controlling first-person gameplay that I've ever played. My goodness.
So fundamentally, I think this is actually a problem that needs to be discussed and addressed, because the gamepad controls specifically are not good in this game.
No, they're not.
And that actually drags it down. I think I could overlook some of the design ideas if the game felt great to control, but it does not. It's very slow and muddy. Your first thought is that, boy, they have some serious input lag issues, but I'm not entirely sure it's input latency. I think it's actually more the way they handle their acceleration curves on the stick. And they do actually have the option to adjust the acceleration and deceleration curve in the options menu on console even. And I did fiddle with it, and it is possible to slightly improve it, but I find that I could never really get it to the point where I was entirely happy, so it just always feels slow, muddy, not fun to aim, and it makes all the combat much more tedious than it should be,
Yeah, and even when playing with perfect precision on a mouse and keyboard, I would say that, like I was saying earlier, the combat is pretty binary. It's like either you stealth or you engage with the characters directly, for the most part, and that direct engagement does usually just boil down to avoiding attacks and trying to shoot them to death.
Well, on paper, that doesn't actually sound bad, right? Like that's totally
Could
fine.
be
It's
okay,
just,
but
it's not the concept that's the issue. It's the way it plays out. It just doesn't feel right. And that's a big thing to keep in mind here. It harkens back to an older era of shooter during the PS360 days when everything was laggy. It kind of feels more like like that era of game.
Yeah, that's funny.
But you know what? Tango's games have never had responsive camera systems. If you play The Evil Within 1 and 2, they're actually similar in a sense, so that's actually a good reference point. The difference there is that they were primarily third-person games, so the looking around aspect of the camera, it felt a little mushy, but it was fine. But when you translate that to first person, it's no longer fine, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one thing that is not of the PS3 and Xbox 360 era is an Unreal Engine 4 feature, or 2, that this game has, and that is ray tracing, John. This game on both PC and console supports, or on PlayStation 5, supports ray traced reflections, which are used all throughout the city. Like John was saying, it takes place at night, and everything is wet. It rains also occasionally, but everything usually has the puddles on the ground. On top of this, there's all these neon lights everywhere, metals, plastics, and things like that. This game has a ton of ray trace reflections, and I think, you can turn them off with one of the modes, but I think they actually do really, really aid the game's visual look here on all platforms. And as well, there is ray trace shadows.
Yeah, that one's interesting, though, because it doesn't seem to be sort of a global solution. Specific light sources and objects will present ray traced shadows, but then in other scenes, you won't have them. I'm not entirely sure how they decided how to implement that, but
I have no idea.
I don't know. I'm a little bit surprised by the choice they made there, and I'm not entirely sure what they're thinking.
Yeah, there's a number of scenes where you'd think they'd have ray trace shadows, but they don't. So it must have been some sort of arbitrary decision at some point in development. Who knows?
To say something very positive, like you said, the ray traced reflections I think are excellent in this game, and I think it makes a really strong case for it. Because the reflections are so prominent in the game, SSR artifacts become far more distracting as you're looking around the scene. Unfortunately, transparency reflections are not in. They just use SSR on those. So if you're looking at like glass, for instance, that is an SSR reflection. So there's still some artifacts there, but by and large, I think ray trace reflections are something you do want to use if you're playing on PS5. And don't worry, we'll get to the modes, because that's going to determine a lot, I think. The other thing to mention real quick, as you noted, this does include Unreal's screen space global illumination feature, which we saw in Gears 5, I think was the first one when they added that in.
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
It is a nice thing. It does have some drawbacks, of course, and sometimes you get sort of an illumination where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. But the weird thing is that since you're playing it on PC, you notice that on PlayStation, it's actually rather grainy and noisy in comparison.
Yeah, I can't figure this one out. No matter what settings, resolution, whatever I set on PC, it looks different. I originally thought it was film grain, but you're just like, when you walk around, you don't see it so much outside, I would say, in the city, but whenever you're in an indoor scene, it becomes more obvious. Because, I think the walls are like beige colored or something like that, where you can see tonal differences differently, more easily. And there, it just, man, it's so grainy. So I don't know what they're doing there, but the SSGI in this game doesn't do the image quality favors.
I think at this point, the basics are established. It's a very nice looking game overall. There are some drawbacks, of course, but I think they did a great job in the visuals, right? We had some disappointments with the gameplay, but that's going to vary from person to person, and the controls are less responsive than we'd like, right? So you've made it this far, and you're probably wondering then, which mode do you play with? Because when you go into the options, it actually does present you with 6 options. But in reality,
oh my goodness,
it's actually more like 10. So we'll get to that. So for this part then, I actually want to walk through them one by one to explain what they are, what they do, and our thoughts on them. And then at the end, I think we will share our recommended settings, so to speak. So let's get into it.
Okay, so let's first start off here with quality mode. This one is the best looking mode in terms of raw fidelity. It's running at a resolution near 1800p here on PlayStation 5. It has the ray tracing set to on, and it's using a 30 FPS cap. So that sounds all good, and usually this is one of those modes that we'd really love to recommend based upon the fidelity for those who like that kind of thing. But the Digital Foundry nemesis has appeared in the corner of the screen there. Yes, this game has a improperly implemented frame rate cap, something we've seen in other Unreal Engine 4 games before. But here, that cinematic look, even with the motion blur, you can really feel the improper frame pacing on camera movement for sure. And this is a shame, because otherwise this mode would be one that would be easily recommendable.
Yeah,
right?
honestly, if they were able to solve the frame pacing issues here, I think this would actually be an excellent choice, because the actual stability of the mode is very sound. You can see that it hits the 30 FPS target, but with incorrect frame pacing, it looks very juddery as a result. So it's definitely a letdown in that regard. And of course, running at 30 frames per second only exacerbates the issues with the mushy controls, so it kind of doesn't feel great either. So in that sense, I would have to admit, unless you have no issues with incorrect frame pacing, I would scratch this one off the list.
That's good to know. Okay, so what's next on the list?
All right, the next option you have, and I think this is the default. I can't remember, but I think it's the default. It's performance mode. And this one is pretty simple. It comes around 1440p, and it disables ray tracing. And that's about it. But I think it's actually a good choice. The image quality is not bad. And by the way, we should mention that the console version does seem to use AMD FSR.
Yes.
But I think it's a step up from what we've seen in other FSR titles, in that it's not overly sharpened. In fact, it has a very, very soft, kind of blurry look to it, and there's chromatic aberration all over the place, and Unreal's TAA. So when you have that, it doesn't look noisy or aliased. It just looks kind of soft. But it's not bad. When you reduce the resolution, it still looks clean, just soft. So keep that in mind when we're talking about these modes.
For sure.
But this is a very basic mode, and you would think that this would be the go-to. But unfortunately, I was a little surprised, but the frame rate here does slip below the 60 frames per second target.
Yeah.
So no matter what, you're playing the game, you're engaging in combat, just walking around the streets, again, there's this inconsistency to the overall presentation in regards to frame delivery that just feels off to me.
Yeah, it is a strange one. I just assume, based upon the discrepancy in resolution here, and the fact that it seems to be using a flat resolution from our testing, that it's just too high res at certain moments based upon what they're doing.
Yeah, they would need a more robust dynamic resolution scaling solution, I think, here.
Mm-hmm.
Also, some random areas like this here, there's this indoor section here with all these products on the shelf. For some reason, it runs terrible. Like, let's look at the frame rate here. It drops way under 60 in performance mode. And in fact, this is a problem in all modes. And that's, I think we should talk about those,
Yes.
right? Because these are the default, these are the normal modes you would expect. But then you start to see something referred to as HFR, or high frame rate. And the HFR modes, there's actually 4 variations here.
Oh my goodness.
And we're going to talk about them. But here's where it gets weird. If you're running this game on a television that supports 120 hertz, it will boot the game in 120 hertz mode. And if you select an HFR mode, it will allow the frame rate to exceed 60 frames per second. They essentially remove the cap up to the refresh rate.
Mm-hmm.
So by default then, if you choose one of these modes, the game can now run above 60. And that's the basic idea here. That's what that means. But there is actually another option that we'll talk about as well. So first of all, I want to get these two out of the way because I don't think that they're really worth talking about much. The default HFR quality and HFR performance modes. These come in the 3rd and 4th slot on the selector list, right?
Yeah.
And it's not clear necessarily what they do at first until you start playing them, and then you discover, oh, they simply turn off VSync while removing the frame rate cap, and the result is extreme screen tearing.
I have no idea what they designed this for. We've joked about games in the past that have full-on screen tearing all the time. There's no reason to use these modes unless you're okay with the screen constantly tearing, no matter what you do.
But technically, though, I will say the HFR performance mode without VSync, this is where you get the highest frame rate by far. This is the one that gets closest to hitting 120, but it doesn't really do that either most of the time. Mm-hmm. But it's not worth using. I do not recommend them. Disable these. That's those modes, right? And the idea there is that the resolution is dropped down to like 1080p, and some of the settings seem to be slightly adjusted to that as well. Mm-hmm. And so you're basically getting a lower overall fidelity, but while targeting higher frame rates. Now, this is also true of the next 2 modes, which are HFR quality and performance with VSync, right? Same thing, same resolution, same kind of visual target, but they enable VSync on this, and they still allow the frame rate to go above 60. And so the quality mode then, right? This one is interesting because it does go above 60, but not by that much. It seems to hit in the 70-ish range, but then it can also fall beneath that. So it's highly variable.
And then you have the performance HFR mode, which, much like the one without VSync that was fully tearing, you're seeing slightly reduced performance from that because VSync will have a penalty on average frame rates, but you're looking at generally performance from 70 up to 120 FPS. So like if you're in an indoor area where there's not much going on, 120 FPS can definitely occur, but the larger, more bustling scenes filled with things or general combat in the outdoor areas can go lower down to 70 FPS or so. Those don't, on paper, going up to 120 FPS, they don't sound too good due to the variability, right?
No, and they're not, actually. I mean, judder, when you're over 60 like that, it is less noticeable, but it is still noticeable nonetheless.
Yes. And
the HFR performance mode is where you basically lose most of the visual quality features. It's the low, it's 1080p. It lacks ray tracing, so you're giving up a lot for that. But here's where it gets interesting. These modes are still available when outputting at 60 hertz. So that essentially means that you have 4 more modes to consider. But we're actually just going to do 2 because the tearing ones actually get a lot worse if you're capped at 60. So they're just unplayable.
You'll get mid-screen tears there much more often.
It's so bad. It's so bad.
Mm-hmm.
But the other 2, though, become more interesting. So HFR quality at 60 hertz is actually probably, it might be my recommended setting, actually.
Yeah.
So it does not lock to 60. It does dip, unfortunately, like pretty much every mode. But you actually get a pretty stable 60 in many instances. Not all, but many, right? And you get ray tracing. So you're giving up some image quality. It is rather soft, but you get ray tracing features and you get a reasonable enough frame rate. So I actually think that one works okay, and that's what I've mainly been using for myself. The other one, though, HFR Performance with VSync with a 60 hertz cap, that's actually probably the way to get the highest and most consistent frame rate. So if you really want to keep your frame rate steady, mostly, that's the way to go. So you're basically giving up everything to get there. Unfortunately, even that mode is not enough to overcome spots like this. Again, that's storefront. So this is the lowest possible settings you can get on PS5, and it still dips really hard here, suggesting that it is not at all a GPU issue. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that there is currently no way to achieve a perfect frame rate in this game. Every mode has issues, but this is technically the fastest overall.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the steadiest mode, but at the same point, you're giving up all the nicer visual quality things that we talked about earlier here, like the ray tracing, and also at the lower, resolution here, 1080p internal FSR'd up to 4K. So definitely not my recommendation from what I played. I mean, I did find the HFR quality mode at 60 hertz to still be pretty dippy, but I think in the eventuality of the VRR update coming out on PlayStation 5, which has been announced most recently to be happening in the next couple months at some point, well, that will make this mode much, much better.
And that's the thing, because by and large, most games this generation have run very well, and VRR has not been necessary. But in the last month or so, it's suddenly become a killer feature, in the sense that Elden Ring is a mess, and it absolutely benefits from it on the Xbox. And now it's launching on a PS5 that does not have VRR yet, and as a result, it feels kind of poor in every mode.
Yeah.
With VRR, it actually will be, if it works, it should fix the problems entirely. But if it doesn't, well, that's not good either. Also, I don't think that they've laid out their menu system well here. The UI is kind of confusing, and I think they would have been better off having like the HFR and the VSync option as like a toggle, and then just have performance or quality mode, right? Because that would still give you the same options, but it would be presented in a way that makes more sense. Because as it is now, it's just kind of like, I've heard other reviewers and other people, they just go in there, they have no idea what all this means, what you'd want to use, and you have to test them all, and it's just a pain. And in fact, the mode that we found the best, the HFR quality mode with VSync at 60 hertz, is so specific, because you actually have to make changes on the system level too to get there if you're on a 120 hertz screen. It's madness, Alex.
Who knows?
I don't know what they were doing here. It's weird. I will say, at least, this is like light years beyond their first console release, which was The Evil Within, which was one of the worst performing games of that generation. Constantly running at like 20 FPS. It was awful. So it's not like that, right? It's still perfectly playable enough. But I have to be honest, it's pretty disappointing in terms of overall performance here. And I think that there is actually room to improve it. I hope they consider improving it.
Instead of offering all these modes, what they really should have done is focused on a proper 30 mode and a proper 60 mode and adjusted the settings accordingly. It feels like instead of, whatever the QA time was on making these modes, they should have really just QA timed the performance up to 60 properly.
I agree. So that's pretty much the situation then. And I think we did settle on the HFR quality VSync mode at 60 hertz as our recommended, but not optimal setting, because there is no optimal setting, unfortunately. I will say, on the positive side again, the loading times are very, very fast.
Very fast.
So that's, that does make it less annoying at certain points, because there is some loading here and there. So that's good. They make heavy use of the DualSense if you're into that. Lots of stuff coming out of the speaker all the time. So, there is that. I don't know. I feel like we're pretty down on this, but I do think that there is still a quality game here. It sounds like the best place to play it is on the PC, though.
Kind of.
Although we'll have to wait for your video to find out.
Kind of. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That has its own issues, too. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's Ghostwire Tokyo. I don't like it as much as either the Evil Within game, but you can still see that there's something quality here in terms of what they've done. and you have to decide, do you want the Far Cry formula set in nighttime Tokyo with a cool Japanese twist? If you say yes to that, this might be up your alley. If not, then, there's other stuff to play too. So
Yeah, if not, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.
Oh, no. You got it in there, Alex. All right.
Yeah.
Yes, all that good stuff. But that's going to do it from us. So thanks for joining me, Alex.
Of course, though, John.
And thank you, audience, for watching. We'll see you next time.